So everybody already knows we're talking about Carl Jung basically, alchemy and psychology together more broadly. So Jung, especially towards the middle and later parts of his life, about age 55 or so, really discovered and gave him this book spurred him on to find out more. Like he didn't even look at it at first, didn't think it had any value to him, so he ignored it, sat on his desk. He finally started looking at it. Everything he saw in the book was shocking immediately to him. He immediately saw the archetypes, right? And if you know anything about Jung, you know that a big part of his psychology was based on this idea of archetypal imagery, right? So, and his philosophy is basically a spiritual recognition in psychology, whereas Freud thought of religion or the spiritual experience as something that was all in your mind, basically. He thought it was an ego-driven mechanism that, well, you know, it was a way to reconcile mortality, basically, which makes sense. I mean, it makes sense, but Jung thought it had to be more than that. In real psychology work, when they do therapy, they find out that the human condition is much more complex, and really that if you try to, it's like anything else in psychology or in medicine, if you try to boil something down to such a narrow area of understanding, it's going to be really hard for you to understand it any other way. So with Jung, you know, he said, and conversely, you know, Freud's other ideas of the subconscious or the unconscious were that the unconscious mind was a storehouse of everything that's been repressed or psychologically traumatizing to look at. And so, you know, Jung just couldn't get on board with that. So his idea was that if that was the case, if the subconscious mind is a place of all this nightmarish stuff, including imaginary things, monsters and everything, then it had to also be the place where creativity and, you know, beautiful and happy ideas come from, you know, inspiration. And so, you know, basically Freud looked for the nightmares and the taboos of the subconscious, and Jung looked for the creativity, the inspiration, the Akashic, this wellspring of knowledge that we all seem to have, that we tap into from time to time in life. People talk of the Akashic record. It's been called a million different things. And in alchemy, that's really a fundamental idea in alchemy, that, you know, there is like an initiate knowledge, you know, that it actually is built up like in the ether almost. It's in the world. We're born with a natural ability to sense these things. Like you look at something and know that it's cruel or it's wrong or it's, you know, beautiful, or it's the same with everything that we have to make moral and ethical judgments about in life. You know, there's a sense that whether you've been taught something's right or wrong or not, or whether you've been shown alternatives or not, you'll tend to have a feeling about it, and, you know, just an innate knowledge about it. And the more you think about it, the more knowledge will come to you. And it's the same way with the Akashic records, the same concept. The idea is that with alchemy, especially with all the imagery involved, that the actual textual content is really less important than what the symbols and imagery does in your psyche, what it awakens in your psyche, and how it drives the mind into other places, you know, that might not have necessarily been talked about in the text. And that's what you'll find with alchemy, is that everything that you see can be interpreted 100 different ways, and has been. I'm doing the research for my thesis right now, and up until like the year 1900, let's say, end of the 19th century, there was some 1,500 books on alchemy that had been translated to various languages. And since then, there's been about that many, again, that are recorded. So you're talking like over 3,000 like known cataloged books that exist on alchemy, and that's a lot. I mean, that's really a lot. I mean, you can look up any topic, and you're scantily going to find 3,000 books available on that topic. Alchemy is probably the most written about and less read of any topic you can find. It really is. So what Jung discovered was the Arcanum. And the Arcanum is, they're on tarot cards. It's where the archetypes came to have a presence, an image in the West. And if you ignore the fact that this looks a lot like an astrological wheel, because it does, these are the primary Jungian archetypes that were kind of to the forefront of all of Jungian psychology. And you've got these very distinct archetypes: the lover, the jester, which is also the trickster, caregiver, the ruler, the creator, the innocent, which is the child, that orphan. They all have different names for them as well. But then you have the sage, the explorer, and liberation, the magician. The hero, and you can see the two names on each one of them. I don't know if you can see that as clearly as I can, but the hero's journey is a big one. That's really, in Jung's perspective, pretty much everybody has that in them in some way. The hero's journey is something that is like a almost romanticized aspect of who we are, right? We want to be the one that saves the day. We want to be the one that a lot of people, especially in psychology, is they want to be the one to break the cycle of their family's tragedy, something negative for them. They want to be the one to break that cycle, right? So that's part of the whole idea of the hero's journey as well. That's that hero archetype that we identify with. And there's been many movies. A slide just passed with a few different movies and fairy tales. I mean, this is a concept that drives the human spirit in a big way. But what Jung talks about, especially with the alchemical process, which we're going to get to here in a second, is that you pass through different phases of your life when these archetypes sort of take on new meaning, and you might sort of occupy that space at a given time in your life as you discover the world and discover your drive and what motivates you. And so there's these 7 patterns of personality that is a big part of any Jungian psychology talk, and these are themes that we talked about a lot in consciousness studies as well. This is the way Jung would break down the psyche. There's this persona, the ego, the trickster, the shadow, and as you know, the shadow is a big deal. You know, that's where all Jungian psychology filters through. If you don't contend with the shadow aspect, you can't progress in many different things. It's a paralyzing and crippling thing that sort of has to be dealt with, which is an interesting thing with Jungian psychology. I mean, in most talk therapy nowadays is that way. It's about reframing things that are difficult and about dealing with it, bring it to the surface and facing it, coping with it. So the ego is different in Jungian too. Instead of being like I don't know, the ego is like an enemy in Freudian psychology. It's your enemy. You know, it's this horrible thing that like has, you know, this bad attitude, and it's narcissistic, and it's the like the little devil on your shoulder. Jung agrees in a certain way, but it's much deeper than that. For Jung, he didn't promote the idea of totally crushing the ego, and even though there is the ego death thing in the Dark Night of the Soul, right, and in facing the shadow work, but it's not a total death. It's a death and a rebirth as a better thing. He was grilled constantly. Everyone who interviewed him, they were asking him, well, you're saying that religion, the religious experience and the spiritual experience is part of human psychology. Well, what religion do you mean? I'm reading this that you wrote, and this sounds to me like you don't believe in God. Do you believe in God? And so he was faced with these types of questions, and honestly, I mean, if you look at the actual footage, when he's faced with questions like that and has to answer them, and when you hear his answers, I'd have to say that he really didn't per se, but I think his attitude about God may be similar to a lot of people's nowadays, where they're not atheists in the sense that they don't believe there's anything. They tend to believe that there's something, an eternal, I guess you'd say. And so the worship of God is a little bit different. It's a very personal thing. Their idea of God, they may see God as an archetype, as maybe their father or their grandfather or someone. When they're in their prayer moment or they're in their internal moment, meditation, meditative prayer, whatever you want to call it, that's what they're picturing, right? And I think that's honestly more powerful than picturing somebody else's rendition. The Hindus have, however many gods. It's a lot, right? And so is it better to allow that archetype to manifest inside you, where whatever this spiritual being or this guiding aspect is, what you see is something that you can relate to, right? So that's literally the biggest differences with what Jung had to say. And I think he was put to the frying pan way too much early on, and then when he got older, he was so cynical about it that every time they would ask him, well, do you believe in God? He's like, well, I've answered this question 800 times, you know what I mean? Like, well, do you? You know what I mean? So it's really a hard type of thing. He never really wanted to say that, because he's talking about it from the psychological aspect, and he wanted it to have meaning to everyone. And he knew that he would kind of be alienating other people, and that wasn't the point of making a religious or spiritual psychology. The point was to open psychology up to the idea that people have religious and spiritual experiences in their lives, and if you don't acknowledge them, you know what I mean, they're not able to be properly integrated. So it really is mostly about integration. But the ego thing is a big deal for Jung, because his idea was to get the ego to serve the self, and the persona is what needed to really be broken down and be restructured in a sort of a more real kind of a way. We can all see ourselves as Rambo or whatever, you know what I mean? And young people especially, but knowing who you are is a difficult thing for a lot of people. I mean, what does that even mean, really? Knowing something, knowing anything really, for sure, right? But knowing who you are is a difficult thing, because you have that ego that tells you one thing, and you don't know if for sure that's the truth until you can bring the ego and the self to terms with one another, and so that the ego listens to the self as much as the other way around. You keep this dual nature, and the dual nature is really a falsity. We sort of always have a tendency, at least, to separate ourselves from the physical experience, right? Most every psychological issue, or anger, frustration, anxiety, all these things, depression even, comes from this idea that you're in a subjective experience. You have your set of morals, values, and your whole sort of script or idea about how things should be in the world. And what bothers you is when things are not that way, right? When somebody didn't understand you and did this, or some asshole is being inconsiderate, and you know what I mean? It's these interactions that we have in the world. This job sucks, this class sucks, this is hard, this teacher sucks, whatever it might be. These are the things that tug at you, and eventually create a frustration level that wells up and starts to take over your emotions. And the ego is the same way, and the persona is also the same way. And the trickster, that's his job, right? So these are aspects of ourselves we can't get around without taking control of them and having this sort of alchemical honesty that I like to talk about a lot, is not believing the false narrative, and truly being able to laser pinpoint into what it is you're about and what the next thing should be, right? So the trickster is a really great archetype to explore, even though it can be frustrating, because all of the trickster archetypes are both positive and negative characters, right? The trickster can help you find clever ways to do things that might save you time, money, whatever, heartache. But the trickster also will pick your pockets, will also convince you that, doing something that's not maybe so wise, that, why not, right? And And it really is it's the mental representation of that. It's that voice that in your ear type of thing. Every time you feel like it's comfortable and right, it's that thing saying, but what if, but what if, but what if, so you'll always have that sort of doubt, and the more control you have over that, the less you'll be apt to making foolish mistakes, or believing in something that was probably a not wise thing to get behind. And so the trickster, those three aspects of the self are the pervasive ones. They're in alchemy what you called dross, right? So we'll talk about in probably in the next session, we're going to talk about these processes that involve elimination of dross and transformation of these dross elements of the personality, of the psyche in general, that gives you basically the rest of your life to work on it, and we're going to talk about more of that. The anima and animus is one that's huge also. And all of these really do correspond to some aspect of the alchemical and hermetic philosophy as a whole. The anima and animus is the male and female aspect of the self, right? And this pertains to the principle of gender in alchemy and hermeticism, right? So there's 7 principles. One of them is a principle of gender, and it basically states that everything is gendered. Everything alive is gendered. There's a male and female aspect of all things, right? And that until both aspects are reconciled, once again, you can't be a whole person or whole thing, right? So in alchemy, you'll see the hermaphrodite a lot. There's always some creature or human or whatever that shows some hermaphroditic principles. They're half male, half female, and depending on the context of the pictogram you're looking at, that will have a different sort of meaning, but it all boils down to this principle of gender. And in Jungian alchemy, it was the anima and animus. If you were having problems with a feminine issue, Jung would say, well, have you gotten in touch with your feminine side? Have you gotten in touch with your animus, right? Because there's things that each has that are beneficial to the other, right? So if you're all
anima, then you're too male.
You're going to act and be of a type that is less understanding of things that are part of the female aspect: compassion, empathy, nurturing types of things. These are female aspects of every creature, and so for Jung that was a big deal too. It was for men to work on their animus, and for women to work on their anima. That's a lot of the reasons why people believe that women are less effective in certain things than others, and men are less effective in certain things than others, right? There's been this sort of dividing line, I mean, women didn't even used to be able to vote in the United States. We're such a free republic, right? But not until very recently were women even allowed to vote. So this is an important thing to take into account when exploring any side of psychology, if you're in a therapy situation where you're the therapist or you're the patient, it doesn't matter. Understanding this idea that we have a female and male aspect, and taking that into consideration when it comes down to why you're feeling, why you're doing, why certain things are the way they are. And the wise old man is what Jung called it, but it's really the wise old person, right? So I've got a picture here of the crone, right? So the crone is a very, very powerful archetype, especially with the earth religions, because they're so geared towards goddess worship and inclusion of the female aspect. Really, if you want to make a dividing line between modern monotheism and really the great religions and look at what's the difference, the biggest difference you'll see is that it's mostly there's a male god in those, and there's a female goddess who takes precedent in the others, right? So the difference is, what people feel is more natural. Like goddess religions don't believe that there's not a god. They do. They believe there's a god also, right? So they're automatically polytheistic, right? And so alchemy was friendly to the polytheistic sort of line or thread of thought. There's a lot of people in the early days, and still to this day, more people to this day than were back then, but even in the very beginnings of monotheism, it was not like appreciated so much. But for women, and really for men too, these aspects of the female are important to recognize, and because men have them too. They're just not as well defined as the females are. So the maiden would be the virgin, would be the purity, and that's transferable to either gender, but that purity, innocence, beauty, those things. The mother is sort of the still powerful but now mated female who's in her prime of power, and her love and nurturing is the thing that sort of is the glue that keeps the union and nurtures the children into becoming something worthwhile. And then the wise woman is sort of the later in life, the postmenopausal female who gains more respect, that gains that's able to espouse truth and understanding, becoming more of a philosopher and more of a wise person. And then the old crone is the great wise woman. This is the wise old man, wise old woman in Jungian psychology, and also in alchemy. There is plenty of examples. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of them documented really well, but the first alchemist, really the one who nowadays people are starting to kind of credit her for being the first alchemist, was a woman named Mary the Jewess, right? They called her the Jewess. She was Jewish. She was Hebrew. But she was the one who invented a lot of the actual alchemical tools, like the pelican, the retort, a lot of the different apparatus, the double boiler. In fact, today we still call a double boiler a bain-marie because that's who invented it. So it's a very interesting piece of alchemical history. A lot of people don't even know. So it's kind of a big deal, and I think because everybody thinks that in alchemy it was a bunch of old men hiding in dark rooms, brewing up their alchemy, but it really wasn't that way. And in most earlier cultures, when it came down to it, especially in polytheistic culture, if whatever, the woman usually owned the property. She made the decisions about money. The whole thing. She was the orchestrator of life at a certain point, and it's really that way for us too, right? When you see your parents or you are getting older, and suddenly the wife starts to get a little more power, right? Towards the end. At the end, it's like whatever she says. You know what I mean? It gets to be like that, and it's for a reason. I mean, women have a special quality about their makeup that enables them to settle in to this sort of wisdom in a way that empowers them and makes them more assertive with it. Men, when they get into that sort of later wise age, tend to shut up and sort of go inside themselves, and that's sort of the balance that is important for the world, for men to find. And there's aspects of both that really could do themselves a big favor by working harder towards coming together as a whole thinking being and a whole acting being, rather than settling into one or the other because it's more comfortable or safe. So that's a big part of Jungian psychology. And we'll go on from here. All right, so this is the biggest probably place that you're going to find the Jungian actual comparisons in alchemy, and that's in the shadow work, right? So individuation, this process that is really at the crux of all Jungian alchemy, all Jungian psychology, is the idea that there's a certain point, or many points. I believe there's many. A lot of people tend to think that it's one thing you go through and suddenly you wake up. I don't think it really goes like that. I think that there could be many phases of your life where you will be faced with that same kind of challenge, right? Where your reality suddenly is breaking down. It comes to a point where you're faced with the dilemma of recalibrating, resetting, right? So how do you do that? For a lot of people, the big one, and the darker night of the soul, that is a big part of what's been studied and what's been worked with in Jungian psychology, which is facing this sort of darkness, this dark side, involves this individuation process. And I think being that, I think most of us have gone through that and can relate to it. But individuation involves essentially tearing down and which is part of the alchemical process. And I think this is why Jung zeroed in so much on this particular aspect of it. I think there's actually many other aspects of Jungian psychology that fit very well into alchemical ideas and Hermetic philosophy that he didn't explore as much as he did the individuation process. For him, it was the individuation process was exactly the alchemical procedure. In the alchemical procedure, you have 7 steps, and there are 4 stages of this process, right? And we're going to go through that at the end. But that's where your connection to between alchemy and psychology really, the of it is in this breaking down of the sort of preconceptions of that you had up to that time, and bringing these things to the surface, identifying the things that are useless, benign, destructive, negative, that hinder progress, that hinder more positive aspects of yourself, or more positive actions, and everywhere you look, it's these 4 stages kind of that you'll keep on coming back to, and all of them represent one of the 4 stages in alchemy, right? Jung was also very driven towards the end of his life by mandalas. He thought that was another area of symbolism that was incredibly powerful. He saw it in the Eastern practices, and then he saw it again in alchemy. These elaborate carvings and drawings that would, in a sense, give a mental and emotional picture of whatever it was that was trying to be portrayed. Like, so here he sketched every morning in a notebook a small circle drawing, a mandala, which seemed to correspond to your inner situation. So he got into the habit of waking up, drawing a mandala, circle, and laying out sort of where you were at. So it's a powerful symbol in the sense that it gives a way to sort of keep centering and placing yourself in the world. Here's Jung about alchemy.
I was always looking for something in between, something that linked that remote past with the present moment. And I found, to my amazement, it is alchemy. It is the basis of our modern way of conceiving things. And therefore, it is as if it were right under the threshold of consciousness. This is a wonderful picture of how the development of archetypes, that means the movement of archetypes, looks when you look upon them as if from above, maybe from today, you look back into the past and you see how the present moment has evolved out of the past. And we can construct or even predict our the unconscious of our days when we know what it has been yesterday.
There's a couple of big statements right there. It gives me chills every time I watch it, but I put subtitles there because I know sometimes it's hard to understand it a little bit. But he said that he had always been looking for something to connect the remote past to the present moment, right? And he discovered, to his amazement, it is alchemy. Not alchemy's one of them, or alchemy seemed to be like, but it is alchemy, right? And really, I agree that, because I think that, and the reason that I've chosen this as my thesis topic and everything, and the reason that I do this, really, is because I truly do believe that it really is everything. It no matter what type of trappings you want to surround it with, or what archetypal imagery you want to attach to it, or whether you want to try to step outside of that and just be your own self and pretend like none of that stuff exists, right? Is it useful to have to be aware of archetypes and use it in your mental imagery? Maybe not, but it doesn't matter, because whether you knew it or not, you were already doing it. People already do it. So it's really not about learning how to identify and use them. It's learning how to realize that you already are, in a sense. There's nothing that you'll see pertaining to imagery and archetypes that isn't something that you've already experienced in some way. So it really all boils down to, I mean, you can use whatever terminology you want, but it's all alchemy. Alchemy owns the copyright on it, basically. It said that it identified these perennial truths, these things that you really can't deny, and identified which ones you were going to have to reconcile in your lifetime in order to have any sort of semblance of a decent or complete life. And it said, this is what we're focusing on, and this is what it is, right? So alchemy, it's like really could be called alchemy, right? Because it's really a chemistry of everything. It's the most fundamental idea of chemistry. The idea that things that go together will find their way together, and things that don't can't, right? That's chemistry. You either have it or you don't. And everything in the world that we encounter has a chemistry, right? If it's plastic, or if it's metal, or if it's stone, or if it's living human being, human flesh, there's a chemistry there. And there really is truly a chemistry that we can't place our fingers on. That's something along the lines of a blending of the spiritual self and the physical self, the analytical mind and the artistic mind. Like, those things come together in the human experience, in the human condition, and those are the things that we have to reconcile. We have to reconcile the idea that our emotional self, our sort of spiritual self, that feels like an inhabitant of a vehicle, right? That's the way I usually describe it. It's like we have a vehicle that we're in right now. We are spiritual beings having a human experience, right? Not humans having a spiritual experience, and that's really becoming the norm in most people, whether they're heavily religious or whether they're just more of a generic sort of spiritually minded person. They'll tell you that they feel like they are sort of inside this body. The body is something to contend with, right? We have to contend with it. If we don't keep it healthy, we're going to get sick and be miserable, maybe die earlier than we should, things like that. But the reason I'd say probably 85% of the reason that we do have unnecessary ailments, injuries, and untimely death is due to the fact that there is no duality. We are non-dual in our nature. Yes, our body may die, and hopefully, I believe that the consciousness lives on, and I think that most people want to believe that. I think that's probably the cornerstone of why religions emerged, was to sort of offer yourself evidence that there is an afterlife, that your soul lives on after bodily death, right? So, and I think we talked about that last time we were together, was what would happen to the world if suddenly there was undeniable proof, 110% proof that when you die that we don't live on. That's it. You're dead. You're dead. Don't you think people would probably change the way that they're living drastically? I mean, it's my view. How could any type of routine, fundamental, basic aspects of human life be maintained in that way? You couldn't get someone to spend any considerable time doing work for someone else, or doing civic work totally, because the idea would be to save yourself, right? This is my time. My time's ticking away. I can't spend it on you or anybody else, So I really do think it would be a breakdown in really fundamentally all aspects of human life if we suddenly came to a collective realization that there was nothing beyond death, right? So the alternative is for everyone to find some way to believe there is something beyond death. Because if you believe that this physical life is all there is, you're not going to you're not going to be very happy, really ever. You won't, because you'll always feel like you're wasting time, or that you've wasted too much time, or that every situation, every momentary situation that passes through is a hindrance, a cumbersome thing, something frustrating, something that had to be escaped from, right? So you would be able to live in your own skin. And I keep saying it recently, especially, if people truly realized how tragically short the human lifespan is, they would definitely have a different attitude about it. And I think we did touch on that last time as well. The idea that as you get older in life, you start to reconcile mortality at a different level. Young kids think they're going to live forever. They live like they've got all the time in the world. And then when they maybe have their first child and they're a young couple, they start to get more serious about it. So when they start to save money and think about retirement as a serious situation, something worth giving up, sacrificing now for later type of thing. And then as you get to the next stage, you realize that you're going to friggin' die, and it's going to be like tomorrow. It's like it's over already. When I turned 50, everybody's like, well, you're halfway through. I'm like, no. How many people do you know that live to 100? Not that many, right? How many that live to 80? A decent amount, not that many, right? How about 70 or so? Yeah, you're really looking like 70, 75 years old, right? Realistically. I mean, even if you have ailments, if you're not born with something deadly, even if you have ailments, you get lung cancer and all that crap, you'll probably live to about 70 nowadays. And if you treat your body a little bit better at the end, you'll probably live a little longer. So let's say 75 years old. 75 years old sounds like a good age, sounds like a good thing, but when you get to be 55 and your children are 30, the idea that you're going to die in less time than your child has been alive is almost impossible to grasp. It's unfathomable. For me, I'm 52. I don't know how old you guys are. I know you're probably a little younger, I guess, but I know that Socrates is a little younger, right? So we don't face it. We don't really look at that, and that's something about the Stoic philosophy, which is the last part in this series is going to be about the Stoics and about activating this sort of mindset in your life. That is essentially based on the concept that life is too short. It's too short. You don't have time to be worrying about things you can't control. And if you are truly worried about things that you can control, then use your time to affect them. Use your time to make them be what you expect or want them to be. It's a hard thing for a lot of people to get on board with, because it's so brutally it's unforgiving and brutal in a way. But that's the first place you should start negotiating with yourself, in my view. When you're facing a difficult situation, say, what would Marcus Aurelius do? And you go, oh, do I really want to do that? Am I that hardcore, right? Because it will demand that you do the right thing, right? So we don't always face the fact that what the right thing is, right? We go, well, I can do this and it won't be really wrong. It'll still be right-ish, right? It'll still get the job done. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's things attached to that you haven't thought of, that you haven't predicted, and next thing you know, you'll be on some rabbit trail somewhere, caring about a whole bunch of shit that doesn't matter and that you can't control. So really the idea behind that whole philosophy and behind the process of alchemy is, spiritual alchemy anyway, is to work towards a point where you can be a powerful being and you can be a directed and focused being, because you've eliminated your susceptibility to all these other things, these outside things that are always going to be there to distract you. There's always going to be something there tearing at you, pulling at you, that's hindering your progress. But should it be hindering your progress? Is it right here in the room with you right now, nagging at you, or is it in your head? Right? It's in your head. It's all occupying space in your mind, right? And a lot of times, probably more often than not, a lot of those things that you do allow to cloud and occupy your mind that do slow you down, that cause you to procrastinate, that cause you to set things aside that you couldn't maybe be doing or thinking about, they don't care about you when you're not engaging with them, right? So you're allowing these things, these outside influences, to occupy space in your head and to occupy great vast passages of time in your life. If you add them all up, incredibly pervasive amounts of time, when they're off doing whatever their annoying thing is. They're not thinking about you. They could care less. They're done with you. Your encounter happened and it's over with. And this could be work, or a relationship with someone, or some sort of business. So essentially, that's the idea with the Jung's blending with alchemy, was the idea that it would give a more solid ground for the theories, especially the individuation process, whereby we listen to music, whereby you come to realize that you are not a dual-natured creature, and that you have to face these things one way or the other. We talk about the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone is probably the most complex idea in alchemy, because it's never been in all 3,000 or 4,000 books that exist. And I'm going to give you this stuff to download too, all of this. You hear about the Philosopher's Stone, like this was the focus. This was what alchemy was set on doing, was discovering this Philosopher's Stone, right? And it's not the same thing as prima materia, although it's a similar thing. And I probably can't explain it or break it into any better terms than has already been done in the past. But I think you can come to a deeper understanding of what it signifies if you sort of look within for it. The Philosopher's Stone, the alchemist described it as, is it a physical thing? Is it an object? Well, yeah, but it's not completely that. It's not completely material. It's etheric too. It's spiritual. It's mental, and it's real. It's physical, right? So, in my best explanation of it, I would say that the Philosopher's Stone is not a stone. It's not a particular mix of minerals that you can contrive in the retort and come up with, right? Philosopher's Stone is a communion between these three aspects, the mental, the spiritual, and the physical. It's all three things. It's been described before as something that if you were hungry, you could eat. If you needed to travel, you could sit on it. McKenna said you could spread it out like a carpet and fly away on it, right? And I think Greg, you mentioned the manna in the desert, right? Coming down, and they don't say how anywhere, but somehow they were able to make a food out of this and eat it, right? So this is kind of the concept of the Philosopher's Stone, and I really think it pertains mostly to this place of being in the mental, spiritual, and physical self, where the effects of the world are not such an assault, because you're more integrated as a part sort of them. Atlas was essentially able to escape Zeus's punishment. How? In the mind. He was able to use the mind to overcome the burden and escape it, at least for a period of time, right? So Hermes was able to bestow a powerful wisdom through the mind to Atlas that would alleviate his burden. It maybe could be only in his mind, but when you look at the overall story, you realize that obviously Atlas isn't some guy holding up the sky, right? It's a metaphor, but at the same time, so is the mental picture, right? So while none of it may have any physical significance in our lives per se, there is a metaphor behind it that is important, and I think that's how you'll get closer to understanding the Philosopher's Stone and what it means. Just like every alchemical work and pattern has to do with something physical, but it's just as much or usually more mental. So these are the things that alchemy talked about back in the day. The elixir of life, turning lead to gold. And the lead to gold thing is something I don't think I really have to get into much with you guys, but it, and most of the modern alchemy says that it was to uncover the golden human spirit, like the gold aspect of the self and the human spirit, right? And here's the 4 stages I'm going to show you guys coming up, and just briefly speak on each of them, and then we're going to talk. And usually you will see, you might not see all 4. It's Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, and Rubedo. And these are the stages of the alchemical process. The Nigredo is the blackening. It is the beginning of the dark night of the soul. It's the beginning of the facing the shadow. And it involves, in alchemy, and it involves a process called blackening, or the Nigredo, where you reduce the thing to whatever it is, to ash. It's basically rendering it to its most. The idea in alchemy was that ash, the burnt out state, was the base state of all things. Anything could be reduced to basically ash. It could be chemically reduced by solvent, or it could be burnt to ash. So the blackening involves that process, taking it down to, and psychologically it means breaking down all of your psychological constructs and preconceptions to a point where it's ash. Relationships, whatever it is that are the binding contracts in your life, to a point where they no longer almost have any meaning. Surrendering. It's a surrendering of the self, essentially, and it's the beginning of that very difficult at times process of individuation. So the first stage would be blackening, would be this dark night of the soul, this preparing yourself for ego death, and before you would pass out of the blackening, it would be the ego death. So the ego death takes place during this Nigredo period. It's the Nigredo, if you wanted to put it side by side, it would be the dark night of the soul. It's the same essential thing. Now there are within these 4 processes, these 4 stages, there are processes. There are 7. There's actually more. There's actually 8 or 9. But in all of the perennial philosophies, they like this. Everything is 7. You'll notice that everything is 7. And even if there's 8, they try to blend 2, whatever it takes to keep it at 7. But this process, in this depiction here, you're seeing a relationship, right? You're seeing a communion with people. Well, the Nigredo you might see the Nigredo depicted with a whole bunch of different things, and these were the aspects of life that had to be, broken down, that had to be not eliminated, but rendered to ash, that had to be reconciled in some way, right? So in this sense, it would have been a relationship. It would have been, a female or a male, depending on what you are, and then the relationship that needed to be set aside. And this point right here, the Nigredo transparens, this is the end of the Nigredo process. This is when everything washes clean. Like you add the liquid, the solvent, and everything's settled, and so it's clear, right? You're ready to move towards albedo now, because all of these aspects are now cleared, right? So that's what Nigredo transparens is like this point where everything has been reduced to the point where you can see through it now. And a lot of the depictions you'll see of the Nigredo involve that, the burning of the self, essentially. And this is one of the depictions you'll see of albedo. And strangely enough, Jung sort of stopped at albedo. I mean, he didn't not recognize that there was more, but he sort of incorporated them all and called it albedo. He didn't talk so much about rubedo or the great work or mastery per se. I think he thought that was more of that was too much for like the average person. So the individuation process sort of stopped, in a sense, at albedo, and then gave you the citrinitas to take in your back pocket, essentially. And I'll explain what I mean. So albedo is the purification of the self. It's a new outlook, a new mentality, a new sense of clarity. Anything you would basically associate with whiteness, right? It's called the whitening, albedo, and this is the pure self that emerges from the blackening, right? It's the pure properties that have been distilled out of the blackening. Citrinitas is often left out in most alchemical stuff that you'll read, or if you're looking it up, you won't even read about Citrinitas. But Citrinitas is vitally important. It's the stage between albedo and rubedo. It's between mastering of the self, or at least to a degree that you've identified the true self. You've gone through this individuation process, and now you are successfully individual and successfully integrated, right, with the world. Well, Citrinitas is vitally important to mastery, to the great work, to accomplishing the goal, which is life mastery, right? It's for every religion, for every philosophy, every self-help you can get into. It's all about mastery of the life, mastering of yourself, and coming to a completion with that, right? An expression of it that completes you, essentially, right? We strive most of our lives, right? We're in a state of perpetual striving most of the time in our life. We're never exactly who we want to be, right? We might have thought we were going to be a great actor or a great, rock star, or Indiana Jones or whatever, and so we go to school and we do things to try to work towards being that, right? So the Citrinitas is the yellowing, and it's identified with the sun, with illumination. So Citrinitas, you look at it as this stage of illumination where you've become an illuminated person, illuminated spirit, right? And that was the fundamental basis of the idea of the Illuminati, was this illuminated perception, right? It was to make use of the clarity and the wisdom that they had in their hands by being in the world that way, being in the world in an illuminated way, where you're able to navigate and sort of master, I guess you would call it, the situations that you're faced with in your life, right? So the best way to gain mastery over something is to have a full understanding of it and the ability to encompass it, right? And the ability to sort of overwhelm it with that sense of knowledge and understanding, right? You're much more prepared to face a difficult situation if you're illuminated about what it truly is, right? It's really about truth and illuminating fact. And in this process from Citrinitas, this clarity, towards rubedo, there involves stages, and this is one of them, solvito perfecta. This is the union between man and woman, life partners, and the beginnings of making a family, right? So the idea of reproduction and of passing on what you've learned and what you are to other generations, and unifying with a partner is critical. I've said it many times that alchemy really could be boiled, if you had to say one word, it would be love, because in alchemy you can't complete the great work without always this aspect of union. It's like the bringing together of opposites, and that happens in the individuation process internally, the sort of opposites of the self, and this all can directly be seen to represent a certain aspect of the philosophy. So in this sense, you're looking at the principle of polarity. All right, the principle of that there are no true opposites. Opposites are essentially they're the same. They're only different degrees of the same thing. Like hot and cold, they're both a temperature. They're just a different degree, right? And in different chemistries, what's hot and what's cold might be a different definition, right? So, and everything essentially is that way. Heavy, light, thick, thin, dark, light, right? Every aspect has this polarity, and polarity is necessary. Anytime there's not polarity, usually what happens is an explosion. So polarity, non-polarity is an upset in the balance of natural law, which causes a massive reaction. Whenever there's a lack of polarity, the thing is dangerous, right? So in alchemy, it's essential that there's a union of some sort. It's not to say that someone who lived their whole life and never got married and never had children couldn't achieve for them the great work. It's saying the great work, the magnum opus, is this completion of this process. It all reverts back to nature and what nature essentially is set up to do, which is to, a human being comes into the world, they meet with the opposite sex, their chemistries are needed in the other, right? A woman can't have a child without semen, and the semen can't make a baby without egg, right? So this is what's meant to happen in nature, and so the alchemical process in that sense is essentially natural law in action. It's completing the process that you're here to do, essentially, and not having it destroy you. And the process is the psychological part of it. So it really did have a lot to do with the Jungian alchemy. It really did have a lot to do with relationships and how to better facilitate a natural flow in them. And I've got a couple slides here that are going to feed out while I'm talking, but these principles are what Jung attached really everything he had done up to that point. He started plugging into this alchemical imagery and sort of philosophy because it fit so perfectly. And you saw him almost pleading, right? This is one of the most brilliant men that's ever lived, saying, I didn't know, I was shocked, right? He really lived his life as an alchemist. There's home video and stuff of him like in his backyard with a kettle and like wearing an alchemist garb, an apron and stuff. And he had like a little laboratory. He really did get into it in the physical alchemy too. Artistically carved this sort of mandala into this stone behind his house, this big stone. He wanted it to leave it as a monument, right? So he was doing his alchemy at the end of his life, and from, if you look at the collective works, really from, like, I want to say at least 9, which is sort of the beginning of where he really identifies the archetypes, all the way to volume 15. All of that is alchemy, all of that. So the Jungians who ignore the alchemy, they don't really read psychology and alchemy that much. They can't really tell you that much about it. In my view, they're missing the boat, because that was what it came to. I mean, it's easy to look at everything up to the Red Book and say, the Red Book being the book most people have if they're wanting to study psychology in the Jungian sense, it's the Red Book. But most people don't necessarily have the whole collected works, and each one of them is like the size of an encyclopedia. So most people don't necessarily have that laying around. I'm going to give it to you guys in an electronic version, because I do have that, and I have Psychology and Alchemy, which is volume 12, that I'm going to give you guys also if you don't have it. Anybody who doesn't have it, probably we'll meet up next week or whatever, and I'll have it all together in a package. I've got a few things already, but I want to complete it and make sure that I give you guys something chunky. And I'm also going to link you to a library of books that's especially sort of set aside for this, where you don't have to go out and buy any books. You can just go there. I think I've got 110 books in there or something like that. I may have given it at some point to a link to you guys, but it's always growing. So by the time I'm done with the series, which will be 2 weeks from now, I'm gonna make sure I get everything in there, and some collections of videos and stuff like that. You guys will enjoy watching, I'm sure.